Welcome back to another episode of the Word Podcast, Sports News and Stuff, episode 11. I am James Mundia, joined by my esteemed co-host, Rich Abernathy. The theme of this show is typically sports news and stuff, as I just mentioned in the open, but it's a little bit of a different type of episode today. We are recording this on June 4th. 2020, in the midst of multiple crises around the world and in the country. We have obviously the coronavirus pandemic happening, and more recently the outrage over George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. And so we thought that we would use this episode to talk about our feelings on that, what the reaction has been throughout the world, not just in the political and news front, but there are some entertainers and sports figures that have been chiming in. And that's going to be the central theme of the show tonight. Doesn't really seem to make much sense to talk about anything else.
Yeah, it's hard to focus on much anything else these days. There's just a lot of pain, a lot of anger, and just a lot going on out in the world right now. It's tough to kind of keep a handle on everything.
Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation with my manager at work today. We talk, do a check-in once a week where we do a video call, and it was interesting to get his perspective. He's an immigrant like myself, and it was just interesting to see his perspective on his role in talking to people about certain things. He mentioned that there was a Facebook exchange he had where somebody wasn't really sure of why these protests are happening, what's everybody so angry about. And he kind of jumped in there to correct his friend and seemed pretty successful in changing his opinion. And I think that's one thing that, while this is very angering and it's frustrating, it's anxiety inducing, I think that's one thing that we are seeing is if social media is any indication, people are now being forced, for lack of a better word, to really talk about these issues and how they directly can influence them, regardless of who you are or where you come from. That is a silver lining. So for me, that's the one thing that I choose to take away from this. I think that it's been discussed ad nauseum how angry one can be at what is happening or what happened, and maybe scared about the future. But the one thing I will take away is that I think people are their eyes are being opened because this has become such a repetitive, almost set your watch to it type of incident, that people are saying, well, okay, we got to make a change here. And I think that it's timely that it's a presidential election year and an election year in general. And so hopefully we get to a point where we start to see change at the ballot box, following up people's anger in the streets and protests out there.
One of the silver linings of this is really the opportunity for people to listen and learn. While we've delved into topics of race on the show before, especially the Colin Kaepernick protest back in 2017, we've always kind of done it more through the lens of sports. And while touching on key issues and themes and important things, it's always sort of been more of a micro view of certain aspects of it. And while I like to think that I have a decent perspective on everything and am inclusive in my life and the people that are in my life, I also have to recognize that it's pretty impossible for me to fully empathize. And while I can be aware and while I can sympathize and I can see what's happening, it just doesn't affect me the same way that it affects other people. So it's been important to me, and there's been a renewed emphasis on my part of listening and trying to talk to people who have a little different perspective than I do. And whether that's on the show here over the next hour or so as we talk, and just in general daily life, I'm trying to, while I have my opinions and while I see things and while I've come to some conclusions on my own, I do think it's important to seek out additional perspectives and talk to other people and continue to challenge yourself in how you look at these things and what needs to happen moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's key, is that I remember I was watching a a recap of a commentator today talking about the issue, and the image of George Floyd with the officer on his neck was kind of prominently displayed, and I think that sums up where we are. You're kind of forced to deal with it. There's an example, and I don't remember which city or town this happened in during the pre-civil rights movement, but there was an image of at least one man who'd been lynched by a lynch mob, and there were people in this. It was a picture that was taken. There were people around looking at it like it was some kind of like parade or festival. It was like a guy that had clearly just been killed and was hung. And that picture being published actually ended up really changing a lot of perspectives on race relations, because people were like, wait, this is a really grotesque thing, and they're looking at it like it's a party. They're celebrating it. And so while I don't like looking at that image of George Floyd, I think it forces people to say, you know what, like I can't really ignore this anymore. Or at least I need to do something or be aware of it. I think is the first step. So yeah, with that in mind, it's still been a pretty challenging week. A couple of weeks here. We're seeing a systemic or a look at the systemic issues that kind of come into play with the way that law enforcement deals with their communities. I think it's something that's always been a topic, but now we're starting to see, just based on good reporting and the images that have been presented to us, that there's going to need to be some big time reforms. And the police reaction to the protests also kind of brings back to the way that civilians are sort of, obviously if you're being violent or you're endangering others, that's one thing, but there seems to be a real disorganization around the response. At least, again, that's the way it's presented in the media. So I'll wrap up by saying this. I was watching a video. It was there's a person I follow on Instagram, who's sort of like a up and coming actress, but I started following her because she was on Vine and had funny skits. She was live streaming this thing in LA where a liquor store owner, a family owned liquor store, they were about to get looted. It was clear.
This was the thing in Van Nuys, right?
Yes, where they put the owner in handcuffs. But the thing that what really struck me was, okay, the cops don't know what's what. They're coming in, they're doing this, that. And then I realized, like, if you listen to the police officer audio in that, the guy was completely bewildered. And I was like, you know what? I think that the police aren't even ready. They can't handle this. Like, that's why when you see people lashing out, you see police officers, there's that video of them pushing that woman down in Brooklyn, et cetera. I'm like, are y'all even ready for this? Because when I see somebody in a bodysuit with multiple weapons and maybe even a riot shield and riot gear, I'm thinking, all right, they know what they're doing. This guy's running up. He's like, where'd they go? Who's who? What's this? Tell me who. Give me an age and description. I'm like, yo, dude, you're talking to her like she's the cops. Like, you're the cop, dude. You're supposed to be under control here, and he's complete. I felt bad for the guy. I really was like, this is a tough situation to deal with. But again, it's one not of his own making, because clearly I don't think that this guy is a brutal police officer. But the way that law enforcement is perceived now, you have people out in the streets rioting and looting, and then now police have to deal with it. It's like a big cycle. And I just remember looking at that thing like, what in the world? I mean, like the reporter was like trying to talk him down. She was like, no, dude, this is what happened. He went over there. There's already officers chasing after him. I was like, who was the police officer here? I just felt bad for the guy. I couldn't even be angry. I mean, of course I was upset that they put the owner in handcuffs, but eventually they seemed to calm things down.
I mean, it made me angry watching it, just because it seemed like none of the questions, if I'm remembering the video correctly, none of the questions he was asking happened until they had already started handcuffing The
Yep.
people they had called them over to help. There was no asking. There was just an immediate assumption of, okay, these are the people.
Yeah, these black people outside the store need to get put in handcuffs, and they did it right away. Like, what the fuck?
And the journalist that was there was trying to help, and I don't know if she was just a little overwhelmed with the moment and just got a little flustered. But I felt like I don't want to put the blame on her, so don't misinterpret it, but could have been a little clearer in how she was trying to disseminate that information and tell him what was going on.
Right.
I mean, she was getting there, but part of it's just because he was rapid fire questions back to her, like you were talking about. But
And he's a cop too. Like, I've never had any issues with personally in my life with police officers, but I understand that there is a level, there's a line. I don't want to get over that line. Like, I got pulled over one time when my sister was in the car, and my sister was pissed. She's like, "What the fuck? Why did he pull you over?" I'm like, let's just get through this." I got through it, no ticket, no nothing, and she was like, "You have much more patience than I do." And I was like, "Nah, it's not that I don't have. It's not that I have patience. It's that I've seen this shit go south very quickly over very routine traffic stops, and this was like maybe 8 years ago. This is, like, so like, he's a cop, so of course, like, I'm gonna be like, is a cop? There's sirens going everywhere. There's people getting handcuffed. There's people looting on the same block. But no, I get it. She definitely could have been a little bit more clear initially.
yeah, and he also could have been a little more understanding to ask questions before he started putting people in handcuffs. But
Oh my gosh, they went straight. It was really weird that they went straight for the cuffs.
yeah,
Straight for the cuffs. People outside the store, put them in cuffs. What? We own the store. That's such an awkward. It's not even the right word for it, but I mean, it's just so ridiculous.
it's true. Like, you read all these stories and hear from people about calling the cops, and they show up at their house and they immediately become a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Torrey Hunter had a story about that this week that he posted on Twitter, Instagram, or at least that's where I saw it. It might have been as part of an interview, but he talked about when he was still playing for the Angels, and there's an issue at his house, and he called the police, and they basically like held a gun in his back and walked him into his house, and he had to prove that he lived there. And then as soon as he showed him ID and he figured out who he was, the cop asked him to hook him up with free baseball tickets.
What?
Yeah. And it's a common theme. And as an outsider and someone who doesn't have to live with that, it's certainly angering and depressing. And before we get into some of the finer points and really roll through this, the one hope that I have from everything that's happening now with the momentum that this has and the movement that is underway is that too often we have these moments where it's a story and it's a focus, and then we all move on to other things. And sometimes that's a necessity of life. There's things happening or something else happens and we lose our focus. And I really hope that doesn't happen this time, because clearly this is not a house that needs a new paint job and some new carpet. Like, we got to get down to the foundation on this thing. And we've got to really rebuild it from scratch in some areas. At least that's my opinion as just a layperson. But I've heard a lot of people echoing the same thoughts, and there's a lot of different ideas of how to accomplish some of that. And we can get into that here in a little bit. But my hope is that this is not something that goes away, and that this stays on the forefront of people's minds and in the forefront of people's attention until we start to see some structural changes. And as bad as everything that's going on with the pandemic is, and with tens of millions of people out of work, again, we try to find the silver lining on the show when and where we can.
Mm-hmm.
And my one hope with that is that there are a lot of people that have some free time on their hands right now. And I do hope that this is going to be a movement that continues the right way and brings about some functional and immediate change.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's what it feels like. And I have to say that I believe that will happen. I watched a little bit of Obama's town hall last night. And you know what? Like, we usually don't get political on this show.
Until the last 2 months?
Yeah. We got to switch it up. I watched Obama's town hall, and I immediately was like, oh, it's like, oh my gosh, dude. This guy, I mean, I just don't even, I couldn't even put into words. I can't put into words how his approach to this is not fire and brimstone. It's what do we do now? What do we do next? And he's doing that with his My Brother's Keeper Foundation. Obviously, he has the Obama Foundation. But what I've realized when I watched that last night, I'd also been toying with. I had it up on my whiteboard in my room. Okay, so like, what am I going to do? What are things that I can do to get involved? So I did take a couple steps, and some of them are still in motion. But I signed up for tomorrow actually to do a workshop with the Biden campaign, like virtual organizing type thing. I have tomorrow off. It's the first day off I've had actually since lockdown, besides the Memorial Day holiday. So I'm gonna also look and see like what's going on with Dallas politics. Who's up for election? Who do I want? Who do I not want? Because obviously we have the presidential election coming up, and that's pretty binary. But there's other things too. I don't think the governor's up for re-election here, but anyway. So I think that people are now, and like you said, they don't have an excuse, myself included, to be like, oh, what can I do? I'm at home anyway. Can I make a phone call? Because people are at a different speed of life because of the pandemic, which, by the way, is still happening, and cases are increasing in some states. People are at a different speed of life. They can have a little bit more time to be like, oh, how can I get involved? Whether in either sense, right? Maybe you completely disagree with everything that's going on. Well, make your voice heard. That's democracy. I can't tell you how to vote or how to advocate, but do something.
Yeah, and as we start to get into this and break it down a little more and looking at some of the systemic issues, I do have a question for you, and this is something we've never talked about, and I'm going to spring this question on
you. I'm nervous.
I'm just curious, growing up, what your family discussions were about the police.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what your initial introduction to it was, what you talked about with your family or your friends as it relates to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have been thinking about that because people have been curious. They've been asking me like, yo, so like, we were having conversations. They're like, so what is your experience like? I'll tell one story that stood out to me for a long time that I didn't understand it till many years later, but I understood it when it was told to me, but I didn't really feel it until I went through it myself. My dad, when we were younger, we lived in Worcester County, Massachusetts, maybe about 30 minutes outside of Boston, maybe a little bit more, a town called Westboro. And I remember my dad we were casually talking as a family, over dinner or something. And my dad said something like, yeah, well, my sister, I wanted to go somewhere. We're like, hey, can we get a ride? We want to go to this thing. And my dad I don't know if he was just trying to get out of it or whatever. That's what I thought at the time. But he was like, well, yeah, we don't have a problem with you doing that thing, but I don't want to be out driving after dark. And I was like, what are you talking about? And I was probably 8 or 9. He's like, well, the police like to pull people over that are black, and there could be problems there. And I was just like, I understood the theme, but I didn't really get it until later and seeing what people have to go through. He also made a comment. It was, again, maybe in the same conversation, but around the same time in my life, because these things run together. He said, every time I leave the house, you have to understand, I have to really put myself together. I have to look like presentable. And that was a theme that he kind of presented to my sister and I. My brother probably hadn't been born yet or was on the way. But he said, yeah, I have to look presentable. He said, because if people see you out there as a black person, they may think that you're dangerous if you don't look like you're coming correct. And that one I remember understanding more quickly than the driving thing, because obviously I didn't drive, and I didn't know what the concept of getting pulled over really meant, besides on TV. So I remember hearing those things and thinking that, wow, this is an interesting state of the world. As a kid, you're trying to comprehend this stuff. Now, when we moved to North Carolina, that's where I think things got really interesting. I moved to North Carolina when I was 11 or 12. So I started 6th grade in North Carolina. about 98. And there were more, I would say, subtleties to race relations living in the South. And again, having that sort of looming over you that, okay, there's a difference here. You still have the same rights as everybody else, but you still have to be careful. It was very subtle. We didn't discuss it very much as a family, but we knew that it existed. And I think now getting into like, for instance, you and I went to college together in North Carolina, and I think we were relatively isolated from that, just because of the campus experience is just so different anyway. But after leaving college, I remember things starting to hit home a little bit more with that you have to be very careful, and as a Black person dealing with police. And again, I've never had any issues on a personal level where I felt like I was discriminated against, or that I was being profiled. In fact, I guess I've only really been pulled over twice. One time was a speeding ticket, and that was totally on me. It wasn't like, I was flying. I was late for something, and then it's like, all right, great. But you certainly understand the that it's not the same rules. Now, with that in mind, and this is what people always bring up as an argument. They're like, oh, it's personal responsibilities. Well, yeah, but the problem is I just saw a story last week where a guy rolled through a stop sign and he got pulled over, and they pulled guns on him and his family. And it's like, just when you think things are okay, or that, it's not a big deal, you never know what's going to happen. The Patriot Act guy, I watched his video today. It was pretty good. But he was like that.
Hassan Minaj?
Yeah. I was like, that triggered a police response? I mean, me. You and I went to college together. There are plenty of things that I feel like I've done in public that would that will trigger a police response, that are way more conspicuous than a counterfeit $20 bill. I mean, the story you and I always tell is, when I was running from your place to a bar downtown, or not downtown, but in the main drag of Chapel Hill. I mean, think about that now. It's actually funny. Think about the context of that. I'm running with the backpack, and it's pitch black outside, and I'm running to go meet my friends at a bar. That's not a funny story anymore. Like, it's not
really not
funny. It's not. That's what I'm saying. I did stuff like that all the time, and I guess again, Chapel Hill is relatively isolated, so I don't know, it's a different situation, but I would never do that again. Are you kidding me? I'll put on a backpack and just start running around at night by myself. I did not look like I was exercising. I was wearing the clothes that I wore to the studio that night. So that's what I'm saying. So if a suspicion of a counterfeit $20 bill triggers that kind of police response, then I am a very lucky man. I really believe that. I mean, like I said, me. I have been. We used to. I remember one time we went. You remember the apartment complex Mill Creek?
Oh yes, I had friends that lived there.
Dude, Mill Crunk. That place was lit.
It was popping off.
Dude, house parties at Mill Creek, boy, you better chill. And they had a pool. One night we went there. We played like drinking games at a friend's place, and then we're all at the pool. And we're college students. We're at the pool. We're just goofing around. There was no alcohol actually at the pool, luckily. But we're goofing around. Then the police come, and it was actually I think the whole entire crew I was with was black. I think it was all black people. And again, we were told, hey, you guys are being too loud, and you need to leave. And we left, and that was it. I made a couple of not off color, but bad jokes to the police officers. They didn't humor me. Fine. But that was it. So again, I consider myself very lucky. I don't think that these systemic problems don't exist. I think I've just been lucky because, like I said, a bad $20 bill. And listen, whenever you give somebody a $20 bill, what happens when you do that? They do this. They take the bill, they hold it up to the light, and then that's it. That's the end of the story. If it's a bad bill, wouldn't they just give it back to you and be like, this is not a good bill? Do you have another one? You know, maybe not accuse them of counterfeiting, but like, this one's not going to pass muster. But instead, we call the cops. And then now the guy's, why is he in handcuffs on the ground with his neck being stepped on? I don't understand this. I'm dying for the testimony. I really want to know what exactly happened. How does it escalate like that?
Yeah, and I don't know if there are any good answers to that question. And what's become increasingly clear over the last couple of days, seeing some of the images and some of the response, and we'll get more to that in a second, but there is clearly a police brutality issue in general, but especially for minority communities. But it seems to be a problem across the board in how they respond to some of these instances. And I know it's a tough job, and I know that there can be complications and reasons that people are on edge. I mean, it's a problem beyond that. It's not just at these protests that we seem to have these issues. And obviously, growing up in the situation that I did, I've had access and been afforded some privileges that a lot of people don't have. And my exposure to police has been pretty minimal. And as much as like I said earlier, as much as I think I understand and try to understand, it's really not possible for me to. And that's something that I've had to kind of figure out over the years and try to realize that as much as we want to show that we understand and empathize with our friends who are put in that position, you have to be self-aware enough to realize that you really can't.
Right.
And that all you can do is to try to continue to further your understanding and try to remember how other people feel as an instinct because of their experiences. And it's hard. And especially in the times that we're in where everybody has to act like they have the answer to everything, or they know what the solution is, or they know what's going on, all those types of things. It can be really hard to say, I don't know. And I think that's an important thing for people to realize, is that a lot of us don't know.
I see the footage, and again, it's edited and presented in a certain way, but I don't want to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time in this type of environment. That's, I think, what, going back to what you're saying is, you know, misunderstandings can get really dangerous very fast. And maybe they're looking for a reason to, you know, make a statement. That's how I felt about the Ahmaud Arbery case. Is like, when it comes down to it, it looks like those guys, you know, whether it was they're going to say it's self-defense or whatever, I think they just really wanted to kill a black person. That's just what I see. And, you know, and so that's why with the jogging thing we were joking about earlier, it's like, now it's not funny because now I can't go out and jog because I'm not going to put myself in that situation. Now I'm like, I'm just going to have to join a gym. I'm going to join in a really expensive gym. I'm going to do everything there. I'm going to, you know, white knuckle grip on the steering wheel when I'm driving there and back because I don't want anything to happen. But it's just no other way around it. And I think these are the things when we talk about the differences between growing up and, you know, certain races. This is not a consideration for a lot of people. Even back when I used to just go out and run casually I lived in DC. It's a big fitness community there, obviously, a lot of running clubs or whatever. You know, I would always think like, oh, I first of all, I'm doing it in the daylight. I'm not going out and, you know, running behind somebody at night. These are all things. These are things that are so natural to me that I don't even think about. And again, it's not because of persecution that I've gone through. It's more about the realities of what we see in the world. Here's another example. I lived in DC, and in DC, or the Northern Virginia area, you don't need a car. You certainly can have one. Traffic is terrible, but if you want to get to work in most places, you don't need a car. But I'd walk from the metro station or the bus stop to my apartment or wherever I was living a lot. And I always had a rule. If I was walking behind someone and they didn't know I was there, I would always make a lot of noise.
Well, that's natural for you anyway. Not to make light of the topic we're talking about, but any chance I can to zing you, you know I'm going to take it.
But I would make a lot of noise to be like, all right, I'm not sneaking up on you. I'm just walking. And this is before the George Zimmerman case in Florida with Trayvon Martin. But it's just that misunderstandings can turn really dangerous really quickly, and I can't put myself in that scenario. Here's another one. I mean, and then I'll wrap up on this. This whole video of that woman in Central Park with her dog not being on a leash, getting mad at the guy. I'm sitting here, I'm like, that to me is actually, I know that was in the middle of a lot of different things that were going on in the country, but I don't understand how you can look at that video and not see that there's a systemic problem. Now, here's why I say that. She looks the guy directly in the face, and he's videotaping it, thankfully. And she says, I'm going to tell the police that there's an African American man threatening me. And it's like, okay, hold on a second. You're telling me, as the person who is allegedly threatening you, that your weapon is that I'm black, and you're going to tell the police I'm black, so they're going to be here in a a hot second, like that to me. And again, she was, I mean, now she's been put on leave for work. This is a person who's probably highly educated, seemingly well adjusted, walking her dog, and she goes right to the chase. And I'm not even going to say that she's racist. I'm not even going to say that. But she knows, you say, hey, there's a black guy that's giving me trouble. Whoop! And the police, and I mean, that's all you need right there. Oh, there's a black guy. He gave us a bad $20 bill. And now we have 4 cops that are ready. I mean, it's just like, people, you gotta wake up, dude. It's just insane to me.
I don't want to say that that's subjective because there's video. It's a pretty objective thing. It's pretty clear and plain and out on the table. But in addition to these anecdotes and moments and things that we see here and there, the statistics bear all of these issues out. And the likelihood of being involved in a violent altercation with police or dying at the hands of police is a statistical fact, that the rates and the likelihood of that happening to you if you're a black or brown person are so much higher than if you're white. And whether it's out of guilt or pure denial, or if you harbor some form of hate in your heart, that people try to dispute that or act like that's not a real thing. That has long been infuriating to me, but to see it continue to play out in such a way and for people to make bad faith arguments about it is just completely irresponsible and unacceptable on every possible level. And so many systems in this country, including but not limited to the criminal justice system, you look at the mortality rates for infants, and it's several times higher for black people than it is for white people. You look at some of the socioeconomic factors. I mean, there's so many ways that this country has the deck stacked against a lot of people. And the fact that people, even if they admit that it's true, seem unwilling to do anything to fix the situation. And this is not a Republican Democrat thing. I think this is something that we're all guilty of. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And for a long time, I've sort of been a little too passive in this, I think, because I think the natural inclination for me has been, okay, well, I don't feel that way. I don't live my life that way. I don't treat people that way. I'm doing what I can. I'm being part of the change. I'm being a positive voice. I treat people with respect equally. But that's not enough. And that's what I've come to realize, and really thinking about it over the last week, is that if I'm not doing something to help drive this forward, other than sending you tweets that I see that make me angry, or us talking or whatever, that's not enough. I can't sit idly by and not be a part of it, because it's directed at my fellow citizens and people that I know and people that I care about. And I need to find a way to be involved and to do something to push things forward, rather than just getting upset and railing against people who do these awful things. That I have to be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think everyone's having that conversation, regardless of race. Everyone's having that internal reflection, because you look at, I was thinking about it. I've been feeling a little bit off lately, and I was laying in bed in the middle of the afternoon. My heart was just beating. And I realized it was because I felt like the walls were just like closing in on me, and not from isolation. I'd gotten used to being at home for. We've been at home for over 2 months now, and working from home daily. It was just that everything that was going on, it felt like is the like what's going to happen next? An asteroid or aliens going to pop out and be like, oh yeah, by the way, we're about to invade, like as if we didn't have enough to deal with. And I realized like so I had to give myself some space and be like, yo, it's okay to just like be not in the right frame of mind right now. But now I think the conversation is transitioning because now people are like, all right, well, we're kind of tired of this. This sucks. It doesn't feel good, whether you're white, black, whoever. It doesn't feel good to have this be a part of your daily life because the issue is, and this is where it gets really scary, is this is the reaction to a couple of incidents, police related or not, that people are upset about. But we're really at a tipping point. If something happens, people are just it's civil unrest is what we're going to start seeing. And by the way, great New York Times photo of a guy looking at the inside of his storefront, and the whole thing is just burned. It's just ashes everywhere. Can you imagine? Like, even if the rest of the world is totally okay, you walk back into a business you put your life into, and it's completely, literally in ashes. Like what? And so this is where I think people are starting to realize, you know what? Like you said, it's not enough to just be like, well, I'm not racist and I don't believe in that. I don't have hate and this and that. Now people we're out there going to start advocating actively. And and funnily enough, 2 months ago, the core discussion of the political season was going to be about coronavirus. That's completely changed now. Now the election is going to be completely about race relations. And that is going to be a very fascinating dynamic because obviously one of the things that people have said about Biden is that he doesn't have a strong black base.
When he made some unfortunate and regrettable comments not too long ago
That
as
was
well.
weird. And it's just like and again, he's always been a gaffe machine. So I think that in that case, and I know what's going to happen. I know exactly what's going to happen. And you're going to have, I would say, starting around September, maybe October, depending on what polling looks like, Obama's going to have to put on that red cape and be like, all right, let's go, people. This is not a game anymore. He's going to have to come out and he's going to have to be his running mate in name only. That's what he has to do. Or the other alternative is that what one of the rumors that I'm hearing, and I'm not connected in any way, but he's looking to pick Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor in Georgia, who I voted for. She didn't win. It was an absolutely maddening night because Brian Kemp, who did win, was also in charge of counting the votes because he was the attorney general at the time. I was like, is this a joke? Is this a movie?
It reminds me of a saying that one of my dad's friends has, and whenever they're playing games or playing cards or whatever, his go-to line is, "All I want is a fair advantage," and that's exactly what that whole situation felt like.
It was. We were watching on CNN. It was so sad. Like we were all like, because I was living in Atlanta at the time, and she was so popular. She actually used to work. She's an attorney, former attorney. She used to work with my neighbor, who was an attorney for this city of Atlanta for a period of time. And we were all in there, had the live polling, and we were just like so devastated because we thought she had so much momentum. But what I'm getting at is that if he picks her as a running mate, which there's a it's a little bit of traction towards that because her national profile grew a lot during her gubernatorial run. That will help bring out the black vote. But again, the main issue in the election is now going to be race. And 2 months ago, I never would have thought.
I was going to get to the political aspect of this a little later, but we can go and address it now. While I think it's important to keep an eye on the presidential race for obvious reasons, because that office kind of sets the tone for the country, especially in times like these. So much of the changes that people seem to agree that we need to make, they happen at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
And so often those down ballot races are names that maybe you're not familiar with, or it's a little harder to do the research. But that's where the changes that need to be made happen is budgets for local police and the different steps and measures that are taken to force them to be accountable, a lot of that comes out of local officials, and they have a much greater impact on those types of things on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of times those are the races that just sort of get pushed to the side, or you forget they're there, or you just pick a name at random, or, oh, I recognize that name. An important thing to impress upon people, and I think it's a message that people are starting to get, is that's where you can really make the most immediate change, is those local offices, local elections, and finding people that are going to represent you in the best way possible and to try to make some of these changes. It's all going to happen there.
Yeah, I agree. And that's something I'm really excited about diving into in my municipality, living in Dallas County, is being like, all right, let's get this. I'm going to vote for the sheriff. Let me get these sheriff ballots popping. Let me see what you're all about. Because now people are, like you said, I think that conversation is happening nationwide, and people are like, this is how you can enact change, just by doing your civic duty. But also, what's interesting, and Obama mentioned this in his town hall, is now you're going to start seeing, and this is really, really exciting to me, is you're going to start seeing people saying, you know what, screw it, I don't like anything that's going on here, I'm going to run, right? And you're going to start seeing people getting involved, or maybe volunteering if they're not running on their own. And I see, so it's like, okay, let's get out in the streets, let's protest, but also, hey, you need people. And Obama said this really eloquently yesterday. He was like, you also need people that are inside doing the job, because a protest is good. It lets people know what you're upset about, what you want change on, but you also have to be skilled politically. He said this in a book that I read about his campaign. He's like, we're outsiders, but we want to play an inside game, because we know that you can't get a bill passed through Congress just because a lot of people like the slogan of hope and change, right? You have to actually get the bill through Congress. The best example of that was the healthcare, Obamacare. They had to do a lot of finagling, the Cornhusker kickback, and people were upset about it. And I was like, what do you mean? This is the playbook that's been going on in Washington for decades. You're just mad that he did it. He used your book against you to get a law that he really wanted to get through by giving Nebraska a kickback. Well, it worked. And so we need to have people that are on the outside and the inside, and potentially working together where it's legally possible. I know that, like super PACs can't actually organize with certain campaigns at a national level, but so that's, yeah, I think that's a good point, is that, you have the ability, even at the local level, to start seeing changes in your community. And I think that's the really exciting thing about this. I mean, and it's unfortunate that it took a really, really terrible tragedy. I can't look at that picture anymore, dude. And it doesn't look real. It looks like you wouldn't even see that in a movie, right? Like movie violence, they sort of have a way of framing it so that it's like, oh, that was crazy. But you kind of, you get the idea. But it's not like they would never just see you sitting on the. Oh gosh.
I watched it once, and I can't watch it anymore.
I haven't seen the video. I have refused. In the same thing with the Ahmaud Arbery, I refuse to watch the video. I've just seen still images, because I can't. That stuff doesn't work. I can't do it. I mean, I don't know if you know. I can't even watch scary movies. It's just too much. My imagination runs wild, and so that stuff is just like again, on the Patriot Act segment I watched this morning, was really good. I actually haven't really messed with that show at all. But I there's another example of a show that I like better without a studio audience. Like, I love just him, and he was on fire, because his whole angle is he's an Indian American, and he's Muslim and an immigrant, or his parents are immigrants. And his approach is, he's so hard hitting on his own community. I highly recommend to you and anybody listening to watch that segment on the thing. It's titled "Why We Can't Stay Silent About George Floyd," because he really goes in on some things that I had no idea. And then he relates it back to the Indian and Muslim community. And I was just like, this affects everybody. This is not a black-white thing. That's what's so nuts to me. It's at first, like, that was what my initial reaction. I was like, oh, here we go again. But it's like, no, everybody should be pissed off. Everybody. Not just because it's a bad thing that happened, but this is how that could be you on the street at some point. If you're wearing the wrong thing, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, your fucking $20 bill doesn't look right, which again, I thought that was a pretty simple test. Again, you hold it up to the light. It's not good. You don't sell the goods.
There's no imminent threat there.
I thought you called 911 when there was danger. That's the thing we learned.
Apparently, you do it if someone tells you to put a leash on your dog.
And
now,
see,
so
there you
who
go,
knows?
and that's what it comes down to. Exactly. It's like
it's weaponizing
Yes.
race, and she knew exactly what
Oh
she
my
was doing,
God.
like you talked about earlier.
It's so. And again, like I don't want to celebrate somebody getting fired, or I think she's not fired. She's on a leave of absence from work or suspended. But yeah, like that's it for you, lady. I don't know what else to tell you. Like that's your approach to things. Like I wouldn't want to even work with someone like that, because if you're going to do that about a dog on a leash, what if your project, rundown that you're presenting to me doesn't sit well with me, and I'm like, well, I don't know about these numbers. Are you going to go to the fucking CEO and tell him that I threatened you or something? Like, well, I don't want to work with you. Like that's your go-to when you're walking your dog. What a mundane activity. You walk your dog, you put it on a leash, and you walk around, you pick up the droppings, you put it in the bag, you throw it out. Why does this have to be a situation where the police get involved? Like, are you that entitled?
Yes.
It's just, like, what is wrong with you? It's the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen. In terms of, again, mundane activities, I thought it was the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen. And then the George Floyd thing happened. I'm like, what the hell is this? Over a $20 bill? I'm getting heated up in here.
All right, let's get back to the protest for a minute, because I think that's an important thing to talk about that we've touched on a little bit. We haven't really gotten into. And you mentioned the looting earlier. And this is something that you and I texted about earlier in the week. But I think it's important, and I know it can be a difficult thing to separate. But that's completely different from the protests.
Yes.
It's well documented at this point that there have been people involved in those activities that are not out there for the protest, that have their own agenda, whether that's to sow discord amongst people or to get some free stuff or whatever. There have been some people involved in that are not a part of these protests in any way, shape, or form, other than being in a similar place at the same time. All that said, and I know the initial reaction is always, George Floyd's family has said the same thing. We don't support that. We're not about that. That's not what this movement is about. Those people aren't with us. I sort of came to the point of, yeah, you don't want to see that. And yeah, that's not part of it. But I can also understand why people get pushed to that point, and that they feel like they continue to be silenced, and they've tried different forms of peaceful protest. And it's always met with some sort of resistance or pushback from people of, now's not the time, or that's not the way. And I think people are just fed up of not being listened to, and they feel like they're dismissed and pushed aside, and their concerns don't matter. And all right, we'll hear you out for a minute, but then we've got other stuff to do, so y'all got to move along. And I don't condone it, but I understand why people might react in such a way and try to basically say, all right, well, if you're not going to listen to anything else I have to say, maybe this will get your attention.
Yes.
And again, it can be somewhat counterproductive, and it certainly gives people ammunition to try to attack the movement as a whole, even though, again, I think those are two separate things completely. And I can't imagine being in that situation where you're just continually silenced and dismissed and told that what's happening to you or to people like you isn't happening and isn't real and doesn't need to be changed. And it also brings out in some people this idea of condemning that part of it more than the police brutality itself. Yep. And that they're more worried about things being stolen or storefronts being broken than people losing their lives and living in fear. And I don't understand how people get to that point. And I saw it elucidated really well by actually a comedic writer on Twitter. And she's written for a bunch of shows that I watch. Her name's Megan Amram. And she said, this is the type of thing that happens in a country that treats people like things and things like people.
Right. That's exactly it. We should have known that this was going to be the reaction, because look at what happened a month ago or a month and a half ago when we started having these conversations about reopening the country. And everybody said we got to get the economy going. We cannot have the cure be worse than the disease, or whatever Trump said in his thing. And it's like, hold on a second. So we need to get businesses back up and running, even if it means that more people will die, but we need to get them back to a certain level of stability, which we don't even know is going to happen. And by the way, I mean, maybe it's because of the protests or because of just everyone being distracted or angry, but I haven't seen glowing economic numbers after the reopening of America. We're still having a big unemployment problem. Consumer spending is down. Savings are up because people are worried about having cash on hand. So we should have known that if it got to a point where there were, riots or protests over anything, that the thing that people would value the most is, hey, wait a minute, these businesses are suffering. Yeah, we get it. That's not cool. We don't like that. I don't like seeing the riots and looting. I don't think it's the correct way to go about things. But now the discussion is about the economic impact. No. Why don't you look at why people are out there in the streets getting angry and fix that? Now, like I said, the picture I saw in the New York Times on the website of that guy standing in a burned business that he owned. This is no winner here. Not the looters or the protesters, and not the people that want change, and certainly not him as a business owner. And so, it's no surprise to me, like what you said that the writer wrote about on Twitter is like, this is exactly what you would expect, is that people are going to just start saying, well, you don't value us, we're going to trash your stuff. And that's unfortunate because, again, people put their lives into their businesses. Even people that work at a retail organization like Target, which for some reason became like the poster child of, hey, let's break into this Target. First of all, you can't go back to work the next day. Your store is trashed. So now everybody's screwed. It's like, and that's why I've seen a lot of videos of people, trying to stop looters from coming into business, basically saying, look, you can't, like Killer Mike said, you can't burn down your own house.
Yeah.
And you made the statement earlier about bad faith arguments. It's like, why would you try to focus the discussion of what's going on now on looters and rioters when the reason why they're looting and rioting is still not resolved?
And not only that, but the vast majority of these protests have been peaceful.
Exactly.
Or majority peaceful, even if at the end things start to turn and there's some altercations. That's usually after it gets dark and things start getting a little tense. But I feel like most people are coming at this in a disruptive but peaceful way. And it's such a small part of it, but it's like anything else. That's what people use to get clicks or to have conversations or to try to both sides things, which is the new thing to do, especially for the New York Times. And we'll get to the media a little more here in a second, but it's such a small part of it, and it's really separate from the movement and what's happening, and it's counterproductive. And I certainly can't sit here and say that no one who's out there protesting is looted. I can't. We don't know, but certainly anyone who's been involved in it is not adhering to what the movement is about and what the people who are really trying to mobilize and organize are trying to do. It's not a part of it. And it's unfortunate that it happens, and it's regrettable, and it's counterproductive to the overall movement. And I just hate the way that it's been framed and brought into this, because that's not what this is all about. And as sad and despondent as all this has made me at times, I am encouraged by the volume of support and people that are coming out to express that this is not acceptable anymore. And it's long overdue and should have happened a long, long time ago. But we can't worry too much about what we should have done. We have to take advantage of the opportunity that we have now. When you protest, it's not always easy. It's not always pretty. if you're not being a little disruptive in some way, shape, or form, then people are going to dismiss you, I
Right.
feel like. And whether that's gathering on a street and shutting down traffic or being outside. I know here in Raleigh that they were outside the governor's mansion, and you have to try to get people's attention somehow. And, back when we talked about Colin Kaepernick and the protests that were happening there, everybody's go-to, and obviously we heard more about it this week thanks to Drew Brees, but
Oh boy.
the refrain is always, well, that's not the place. That's not the time.
I think what's so shocking to me, and I've been thinking about this while we've been talking today. Maybe I've been leading up to this, just in my natural thought progression has led me to this point, is when we learned about the civil rights movement when we were in high school, right? That we took U.S. history. I took AP U.S. history when I was a junior, and then I took AP politics and government. One of my favorite classes I've ever taken as a senior. We learned about the civil rights movement. Look at the way that they frame the protests. The March on Selma, which is still celebrated yearly by everybody, and we don't frame those as, oh, these violent, hurtful acts, but we frame it as this is what was necessary to get a very needed civil rights legislation passed. And the way that because I don't know if it's because we're just so myopic now, we can't zoom out, but these protests are trying to do something similar. We need to have systemic change from the top down, as you mentioned, all the way down to local governments. And the way to do that is you protest, you get people's attention, and you organize. So this whole idea that I'm seeing presented on news organizations and certain pundits saying, well, it's taking away from what they really want to achieve. No, it's not. It's part of it. Unfortunately, it has to be part of it. But again, I'm sure the same thing was being said in 1964 when they were trying to pass civil rights legislation. Oh, what are these people doing? Oh my God, I can't believe they're out there running in the streets and the police have to be cut out and there's fires burning. It's like, yeah, well, people are angry. I'll give another example. Nelson Mandela and apartheid protests. I mean, he was put in jail for almost 30 years for trying to fight for equality. Now, do you think anybody's going to look back at the way that he tried to organize before he was thrown in jail and say, well, he could have done it differently. Could have been more like less violent or what? Get the fuck out of here. If you look back at history, it's uncomfortable, but these things had to happen. And I'm just so confused as to why this is why history is a mandatory subject in schools. Our perspective of time is changing because of how much information we have to ingest. And I just don't, people just don't understand that we have been through this before in the last 60 years in this country, let alone in other countries. So it's just like my manager today was talking about, he was doing, he's maybe I call him about 10 years older than me. I'm not sure exactly, but he was doing marches in his home country. We're both immigrants in his home country, like about some civil rights issues. And he was sharing his experience with that, which was really cool. It kind of, helped us bond a little bit more. But like, again, it wasn't like he was doing this 50 years ago. He's not that old. He's, again, maybe 10 years older than me. This is happening. This is what happens. This is what life is. This is what democracy is. You're upset about something. You go out there and you talk about it. You do a podcast on it. You donate. And we'll get to the action items that we can do as people individually later. But this should not be like, well, they shouldn't be protesting because it's taking away from their main goal. No, it's not. You're talking about it, aren't you? That's what I wanted. Jesus Christ. Before we get into government and media and stuff, I will say I'm giving the media a C- right now. C-. Not good.
Well, to me, there's different parts of the media response because I think a lot of the reporting has been great. That it's been updates on what's happening, it's videos, it's pictures, especially as disinformation tries to come out painting things as violent or people starting things. I do think that a lot of local media and national media too, but I feel like they've been really well covered and they're showing what's happening live. I mean, I've spent time watching live local
Hmm.
news. I know you and I were in contact over the weekend and watching some live
Yeah,
YouTube streams, which were in LA, which were
that was
wild.
crazy.
And so many members of the media have put themselves in harm's way, and some of them have borne the brunt of
Yeah,
this because they've been attacked despite clearly identifying themselves as journalists to police, and they just don't care. And while some of the larger discourse, and when you get into the 24-hour cable news and some unfortunate op-eds that have happened here recently, and you get a little of the both sides thing, which I hate, but I think that a lot of the local stuff has been pretty good, and it's been necessary, and it's been informative for a lot of people to really see what's going on, and to be able to make up their minds for themselves and not just be told that this is what happened, or this isn't what happened with the Trump stunt a few days ago. And I'm both surprised and relieved that we haven't really talked about him that much up to this point.
right.
Not because there's not plenty to talk about, but just because it's kind of depressing. And in the 12 hours it takes to get this turned around, I'm sure 5 more things will have happened by then, and it will be irrelevant. But I mean, you saw it with the stunt the other day with the photo op at the church with the Bible of peaceful protesters gassed and forced out of the area, and then they try to say that they were being violent, when every single clip that you see on social media and news and everything else tells a completely different story, and that everybody was fine, and that people weren't out of control, and that there wasn't violence, and these things happen anyway. And we've seen so many instances of that. And I, much like with the looting, I can't sit here and say that no one has thrown water bottles at police or hasn't done anything or whatever. But I've seen a lot of videos where people are peacefully protesting and taking a knee, and they go out of their way to come over and pepper spray them or arrest them or throw them down and all those types of things. And it's really bizarre to me. You mentioned them not really, some police not being ready for what they're faced with earlier. At rallies and protests decrying police violence and systemic violence, to then on that stage just prove their point over and
Hmm.
over and over and over
Hmm.
again, is baffling to me, why they would react the way they've reacted. Now, some of that comes from the messaging that they get from the head of the executive branch, and encouraging. I mean, and that's not a recent thing. He's been saying that type of thing for years about roughing people up when you arrest them and all those types of
Mm.
things. But that's been especially disheartening to me over the
Hmm.
last week, is seeing those videos of, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the picture where there's the little girl on her dad's shoulders, and the police have a gun pointing
Yeah.
right at them.
Well, this is one of the things that I'm seeing in the a lot on social media with my friends that are a lot of friends in North Carolina that I'm very proud of, that have been advocating and sharing information, is the demilitarization that's necessary. Because here's the thing, and this is what we talk about when we talk about systemic issues. Because let's think about what we thought of police when we were 10 to 12 years old, regardless of race or where we lived. Police were people that were around in your community. They pulled people over that were speeding. If there was a robbery, they would come, or but what has happened is that the police have become, over the years, have become extremely more militarized. And that, here's the thing, when you outfit somebody, an organization, with the same tools that you would use for a platoon in a foreign invasion, they are going to act in that way. Their only way of working is not to de-escalate and say, "Hey, this is a really wild situation. Let's get everybody calmed down, make sure everyone's safe." It's, "Oh, there's a problem. Let's go. Bring the tanks out. Bring out the riot gear." I mean, it's almost like a reflex at this point. And that is just what's so strange, is we have to really reform the way that that police organizations work, and you get people that are more invested in, okay, how do we keep the community safe? And then you can tier that up and say, okay, if something really crazy happens, we have a unit that deals with that. That's what I used to think that SWAT teams were. But now it seems like every police department is its own SWAT team.
It's wild, man.
Now it seems like something goes down, we got uniformed officers that are beefed up, and then a fucking army. It's just like, what's going on here? Like, what is this? Is not a police force. This is a military unit.
Well, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at a certain
Exactly.
point too, because in addition to escalating on the police side, when you're in all that gear ready to go, the people across from you, if you're looking at plainclothes officers, that's a different vibe than if you're looking at a military type presence.
Yes. Well, of course, you're gonna get scared.
And it emboldens you, and it makes you a little more defensive. And we've seen that play out time and time and time again. It just seems like such a counterproductive way to run this. And one of the big things that I keep hearing about the foundational changes that are needed is an emphasis on de-escalation and putting more people in situations and scenarios where they're going into the communities to try to help and to harbor peace rather than being viewed as a threat. I was talking about this with a friend of mine today in Florida who does a lot of work in his community and works with law enforcement as a part of that. We were talking about finding positions, finding people that really function more as social workers than police officers.
Exactly.
To go in and to try to help educate or try to help stop these problems in a peaceful way and mediation and all sorts of different things where violence or the threat of violence should be a last resort. It so often it seems like it's the first resort.
What is one of the main reasons why we see this propensity towards escalation, arrests, even violence? A private prison industry where it's very profitable to get people locked up and locked up for a long time. That's where it gets really scary to me. Is it's like this is almost a business plan. It's like, all right, we got to keep these people locked up. We got to. I mean, look at the way that they're arresting people that are protesting. Sometimes they're arresting people that aren't even protesting. They're out.
Well, so some of that's to send a message.
The arrest. Oh, the arrest of the protesters. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that at the source of so many things. I mean, it's such a common refrain, but it's true. It's just follow the money.
Yes.
There's money in it, and while that can be a downside, I think that there could be ways to implement that in a good way, because I was reading something today where somebody basically said, who thought it was a good idea that any lawsuits towards police departments for unnecessary force and those types of things, that those get paid out of public tax dollars rather than police budgets or police pension? Is if you really want to root out the bad apples, when their fellow officers start draining money out of their pension account because they have to pay a lawsuit.
Yeah.
That's how you get to the root of that real quick. It's like when coach made everybody run laps because somebody messed up something in a drill, is you would make sure that didn't happen anymore. And, again, not an apples to apples comparison, obviously, but it speaks to the communal nature of holding your peers accountable, where if there's a direct impact on you immediately, you're much more likely to step in and intervene and to try to keep people from doing some of these things versus thinking, well, that's not my problem. They'll bear the brunt of their bad decisions and it doesn't really affect me.
Yeah, I like that. I like that comparison. I think that's and that's part of the discussion that's going to start happening, or that already is happening, is people are going to look at what are the changes that we can make based on the way the system is set up. Do we need to change the system as a whole? Yes. Now let's break it down into pieces. And I think, again, that happens by having people on the inside, not in a dirty way, but by having people basically saying, okay, well, if I understand things correctly, that this is why there's an incentive for prosecutors and DAs and cops to sort of have this buddy-buddy relationship that, kind of pits them against the community let's change that. Let's either vote these people out or change the way it works completely.
Yeah, accountability is the biggest thing, because in so many of these instances, even when people are reprimanded or suspended with pay or whatever. And obviously there's a big union presence that's part of that. And I've read a little on that, but I don't know enough to fully comment or get too deep on the union part,
Mm-hmm.
other than their primary role, just like any union, is to protect the people that are a part of it. And too many times the officers that are disciplined, that are fired or suspended or what have you, is the way the system seems to work is a couple of years later they show up, or they go to another town and they were on another police force, and those things don't seem to follow them. And there needs to be accountability across the board, that if you get fired for doing things like this, you don't get hired somewhere else to do it again.
Yeah.
That seems simple and logical and something that no one would have an issue with, but it seems to continue to be a problem time after time.
Yeah.
And there's an officer a woman was already kneeling, who was protesting, and he comes in and throws her down. And then you see a
Mm-hmm.
black female police officer go up and just get in his grill.
I saw that image. It was
But
unbelievable.
apparently that guy has had like 50 or 60 or 70, just an ungodly number of complaints about excessive force and various things of that nature, and not a lot of time on the job. And I just don't
Oh,
understand how those things continue to happen. And I understand, I want to be careful about how I say this, but I understand that it's a tough job.
yes.
And it's a job where you worry when you go to work every day whether you're going to come home that night. And I'm sympathetic to that. And it's not something that a lot of people want to do or can do. And I have a lot of respect for people who do that job and do it well. But I'm sick of hiding behind the, well, it's just a few bad apples, it's just a few people, most of us are good. That doesn't fly.
Right.
It's too common an occurrence, and this is too big a thing that continues to happen over and over and over again. And to not see that accountability, and even in what we're dealing with now, where it took so long for the officers involved in the George Floyd murder to be arrested and charged. And if you look in Louisville at Breonna Taylor, and they still haven't arrested anybody for what happened to her,
Right.
and they haven't held anybody accountable. And for an organization who's taken an oath and sworn to serve and protect, to not take more seriously the punishment of people who violate that trust is absolutely infuriating.
Yeah.
And I don't understand how it's allowed to happen. And that to me is sort of at the core of, in addition to the policing policies, but that seems to be a core way that a lot of people are recommending to make some structural change and to make some immediate change in how people are held accountable for those actions.
So are you ready for piggybacking on that? Are you ready for my what I would do if I happens to be in the Oval Office as President Mundia? You ready for my solution? Not solution, one of these solutions.
I've been ready.
Okay, this is what we do. This is such a, it's the funny thing to me is, again, it's politics, right? So it's a PR, it's all about PR. You want to, put a positive spin on it. You want to show that you're acting, but you also want to make change. Here's what you do. Okay. You say, you have a press conference, you say, what you're feeling about the protests and the riots and what happened, and you make statements about that. I don't know who you have with you at the press conference, because that's also an optics thing, but we'll let the communications department deal with that, the press secretary. And you say, hey, we are putting together a 50-person panel, a blue ribbon panel, if you will, of distinguished law enforcement officials in the United States, police chiefs, maybe some state attorneys general, etc. And we are going to have, because of how important this discussion is to have at this moment, we are going to have a weekly or maybe even monthly Zoom meetings, because we can't meet in person during this pandemic. And we're going to talk about things that we see that we can do to enact change in our districts right now. So you get someone from every state. Maybe the states choose someone, and then you come together with some findings. Maybe they come prepared with some statistics about their community, and then you say, okay, now based on the meetings that we've had over the past couple of months, here are some things that we are going to feel like we should take forward, either to Congress or to our local legislatures, based on what things we come up with. And we also want to get input from citizens. So here is a link to the findings that we have. Feel free to contact your local representatives, talk about what you support, don't support. But this way, you're making it transparent and you're making it public, and you're showing that you take it seriously, but you're also being pragmatic about it and not just being symbolic. Like I don't believe in what's happening. Okay, great. Now what are you going to do about it? Instead of what we've gotten so far.
I think you're on the right track here.
Okay.
I feel like the default response is always, let's have a commission, let's have a group, let's have a panel. And it never goes beyond the first step.
Okay. So how do we fix that? Or is it not fixable?
It has to be fixable. There is a way. I don't know exactly what it is, and some people might not like whatever it winds up being.
Okay.
But just the let's talk about it and let's make some recommendations I feel like is what has happened for so long.
Ooh, okay. So you're saying we got to be okay. All right. So this is a good workshop session here. Okay.
Yeah. Well, it gets back to the accountability, and even if you look at the policies that are in place at different police departments, people are all over the place with what's allowed and what's not allowed.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that having a base uniform idea of policies that need to be commonplace in every community is a good place to start.
Ooh.
As part of that, having an independent commission review these instances of violence.
See, this is why we need an Abernathy presidency, people. People think I'm not playing with y'all.
I appreciate that you're going to vote for me. That means a lot.
I was gonna say, you're gonna be a write-in. I'm gonna write you in my November ballot. If, by the way,
do that in 24. Don't do that this year.
I was gonna say maybe this is not the best year for that.
This is not a good time to do that. This is not a good time to do that. As honored as I am.
Now, along the lines of a government response, okay, we have to address this. Okay, I texted you this. You texted me. We've been texting a lot. It's been great. It's been helping keeping me sane, to be honest. In fact, that's actually one of the things that I've really enjoyed about this weird period of life that we're in, even before all the fucking race killing started happening, where like things got a little bit dark. But I've like reconnected with a lot of people. I've like been texting like my crushes from like years past, being like, "Hey, like this is a crazy time, but I just want to let you know, like, I was kind of into you." It's been really liberating. It's been great. But that's right. We're gonna start doing a romance section on the podcast here. I'm gonna give romance.
Can we do it in as tone deaf a way as possible, like in the middle of a serious discussion, or is that just tonight? I just kidding. I gotta zing you every now and then, man. Come on.
So, but you and I have been texting, and I know that it's a meme now. I know it's a meme, but I need clarity on this. What the hell was the Bible thing? What was that?
I don't even know.
I don't think that was a Bible, by the way. I'm just gonna throw that out there. I don't think it was a Bible. I really don't. Like Bibles are usually very like.
Well, he was holding it upside down and backwards.
Is that what happened? Because it didn't look like a Bible to me.
Yeah.
Is that why?
Of all my issues with that whole situation, the fact that I don't think it was a Bible isn't one of them.
Okay.
And kind of beside the point. But just in general, the way that this has been framed from the White House and from some members of Congress and the advocating of shooting American citizens.
Yes.
And just compare this to some of the demonstrations that we've talked about on the show before from, a month or so ago with people wanting to reopen the country. And just look at how the response has differed, not only from the president and senators and other politicians, but from the police as well, where you have people carrying weapons, storming into a government building to try to intimidate lawmakers to change what they're doing, and are screaming and getting in the face of police officers, and there are no incidents.
So fucking crazy, dude. It doesn't seem real.
And now you have people that are kneeling and protesting and chanting. And I've seen videos where people are sitting there and all of a sudden, like, two officers just look at each other and nod, and they walk over and grab somebody or start pushing people back. And I don't understand the response, except that I kind of do, because look at what the president's saying. Look what other politicians are saying. And they're missing the entire point. Willfully, it seems. But they're missing the entire point of the protest and what they're for and what they're about. And like I said earlier, it's just an odd choice to reinforce the message of police brutality and the opposition to it by performing some of those acts with people filming, and you know that they're filming it, and it seems indiscriminate, whether, it's white people, it's black people, it's journalists, it's anybody they can get. It's just all about sending a message and trying to disperse people and intimidate people from being heard. And it's unconscionable. I don't know what else to say. It's just as depressing as all of this is, that's on the short list for me.
I think that's the real takeaway. I think that's where this movement is going to continue gaining traction, is the fact that not a month ago, like what you mentioned, and I believe that was in Michigan, where the first people, the instance of armed people going to the state capitol, being encouraged by Trump, by the way, were taking on these police officers. Could you imagine if people did that for the George Floyd protests? How quickly it would escalate into an actual battle of bullets, not people getting thrown around because they're protesting, but actual bullets being shot, officers and civilians getting shot and killed. I mean, I'm grateful that that's not what we're seeing.
Well, based on some of the rhetoric, that's what a few people want.
And even from the White House. And it's like, dude, what is wrong with you? Why? But again, I guess, are things so far gone? I've always looked at it from and this is the problem growing up in like the Daily Show era. I've always looked at things with like a cynical kind of, but humor related eye. Like, oh, that's ridiculous what's happening, but what do you expect? But
some of that's just a defense mechanism. Like, what else can you do but try to laugh at how ridiculous and hypocritical some of these things are? But it's soul crushing.
Well, yeah, now it looks nefarious. Now it looks like, I think he actually does want people to get killed, and people are taking that, or get hurt, I should say. And like when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and it's like, dude, is that the message America needs right now?
It's not the first dog whistle that he's sounded. It was certainly a very explicit one. And I don't even know what to say about some of that stuff, man. It's just, I know we talked about the reopen protests on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And while we were not in favor of people doing that, there wasn't a call for, this is illegal, they should be dealt with force to discourage them from doing this. That was not the reaction. It was more, this is irresponsible to do in this time, and there's a reason that these measures are in place. And if you are against that and you want to voice your opinion, that's fine, but do so in a way that is safe and doesn't endanger other people. And I can see how some people with an agenda might say that it's hypocritical to be against those protests during a pandemic, but not to be against these protests in the same type of health situation. But they're different. That was an instance of people wanting to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able to go here. I want to be able to do this. This is literally a matter of life and death for people.
Mm-hmm.
And while ideally, yes, there would be a better public health situation for these demonstrations to be taking place, I think at a certain point, the movement supersedes the public health questions and concerns. And I do think you see people being, see a lot of people in masks, people being careful. I know there's only so much you can do when you're out in those crowds. And if I'll be honest, while I was tempted to go be a part of this last weekend, my fears of coronavirus kind of helped keep me home.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I've had to think about and weigh how I want to be involved and how I want my voice to be heard as a part of all this. And I've kind of gotten to a point where that's a risk that I'm willing to take because I think this is important enough that it's justified. And if you're listening and you want to call me a hypocrite, maybe I am. But I think that they're separate issues and both things can be true. There's not an either or situation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. You can be concerned, but also still be an activist. But concerned about coronavirus, but also still be like, you know what, I'm not going to sit this one out.
Right. And even acknowledge, yes, I'm enhancing the risk for me and my family members or people that I see. But if the alternative is to do nothing and allow these things to continue to happen, then why am I even here anyway?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's you certainly inspired me. We were texting last night about the potential of you joining up as in protest, and I hadn't thought about it because in Dallas things were getting a little bit hairy. But I think that the weekend presents an opportunity for me to get involved as well. Like I said, I'm spending some time tomorrow looking at how I can help with the political organizing, um, and yeah, they're really. It seems silly, not silly, but it seems like, yeah, why would you not do something if you can't?
This is not a red and blue issue. This is not a Democratic ideal or priority versus a Republican one. This is civil rights. This is human rights. This is people's lives. These are things that affect millions of people every day on some level. And while I am concerned about being out there for my safety, not just from coronavirus, but from police response, I've reached a point where I just can't stay on the sidelines anymore. And I feel like I have to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm certainly looking into ways to be involved in my community this weekend and moving forward. But if that's not something that you're looking to do or able to do, that's not the only way that you can be involved in this.
Yeah, and that's a good way for us to kind of wrap things up is to talk about some of the options that are out there for what people can do uh, to get involved. Because yeah, not everybody might have the ability to get out and join a protest, or maybe they don't have the desire to. So we've talked about a couple of them today. I think that obviously protesting comes to the top of mind, but there are a good number of organizations that are being shared on social media. I just recently donated to a North Texas Bail Fund for people that do get arrested during protests and stuff, uh, to give them the opportunity to not serve, spend time in jail because they can't afford the bail, and then while they're awaiting their eventual court date. So obviously, it's good to stay connected. Again, a lot of it on social media to see what you can donate to.
And it goes without saying, but do your research,
Mm-hmm.
check out these organizations. There's a bunch out there that do a lot of different things. And that's certainly a good way if you have a health condition that prevents you from being out there, or that's a risk you're not willing to take, but you still want to help. That's a great way to try to get involved and to help make it possible for other people to continue to do what needs to be done.
In addition to that, obviously, if there is a change that you want to see on the political side, then we are in an election year, not just in the presidential election, but we have obviously state and local elections coming up for those legislatures, but also for things like district attorneys and sheriffs. So you can also donate to those causes that you like there, but also volunteer for the campaigns, which is going to be a necessary thing. Obviously, we're dealing with a very different campaign period because there's not going to be a lot of face-to-face contact with the coronavirus pandemic still happening and precautions being taken in that regard. So I think there's an opportunity there. Again, regardless of where you sit on the issues, it's important to get involved while you can, if you can.
Even something as simple as just learning and talking with people and figuring some of these things out and where you stand and how you feel, I think is an underrated but important thing. And that alone doesn't solve it, but it's certainly a step in the right direction.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the thing that's been really inspiring to me looking on social media is the number of friends that I have that are not just participating in slacktivism. They really are reaching out and saying, how do you feel? What can I do? And sharing articles, learning about, like you said, listening and learning, and just kind of taking a back seat and listen and learn. Like we did earlier when you talked about my experience with police growing up. It's not something that gets talked about very often with my white friends or friends that are not black. And
yeah, I mean, you and I have been friends for over 15 years at this point.
Yes.
And that's never really been something that we've talked a lot about. It's just kind of a weird thing it's a weird conversation to have sometimes, but it's important to try to have that perspective and to talk to people, and understand why so many people feel the way about this issue that they do. I think it's an important thing to do.
And one thing that I think is also helping is what we're seeing with the protests and the police reaction to the protests is everybody has a target on their backs now that's protesting. It's not just black people that are getting thrown around. They're macing or tear gassing and macing children. That was a tough image to see. They pouring the milk on that girl's head, and on, I think it was on the New York Times or CNN that I saw. And I'm sitting here like, is this enough proof for people that this is getting out of control? Like, this is not like, we're not in a war. That's okay. Let's imagine something crazy happens. We have civil unrest because there's terrorism happening in the country, and the police just have to go all out. This is not a war. These are people protesting police, and the police are, like you said, they're responding in the way that we're protesting against. It's just like, so I think that's a good perspective to have, to understand that this can happen. This does happen. This is what happens to people of color typically, but now everybody's experiencing it that's going out and doing these protests.
It's really kind of pulled the curtain back on a lot of this type of thing. And it is odd to me, some of the sentiment of, well, and it's a common refrain you hear, is like, well, what did you do before the camera started rolling? What did you do to precipitate this? What were you doing to make the police react that way? And the simple fact that we don't have a higher standard for the people who wear the uniform and take that oath and do that job, that, yes, I understand it's tough. Mm-hmm. And with all the guns that are on the street and that people have, and with open carry and concealed carry and all those types of things, I understand there being fear in some of those situations of being put in harm's way. And I'm sympathetic to that. But if you can't react to these types of situations, especially where there, in so many cases, is no imminent threat, mm-hmm. and it's more about sending a message and intimidating people, the fact that those individuals are not held to a higher standard than the people that are out there protesting is a little mind-boggling to me. And so many of these images that we've seen over the last week are people whose only crime was being there to protest. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's interesting, some of the different police responses that we've seen in different communities. I know just here locally that the police response in Raleigh, being out there, being in riot gear, walking around, all those types of things, versus in Durham, where police were kind of ready to go, but they were staying in police headquarters, and they had some cars that were blocking some streets for where protests were happening, but they weren't lined up there in riot gear just waiting for an excuse to do something. Mm-hmm. And while so many people, myself included, have been critical of the police's actions in the past and what they're doing now as part of the protests and all those types of things, I don't think the purpose of this is to necessarily demonize.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, we have to call out these instances of abuse and violence that are unnecessary and egregious. This is not meant to be a referendum on everyone who wears the uniform. Even though ultimately, I guess when you're attacking the system, that becomes a part of it. And a lot of people feel threatened and called out, even if they aren't called out by name, just by directing so much of this attention at their profession. They naturally get a little defensive and get a little upset about it. But I think it's important to not look at those people as a faceless entity and to look at them as fellow citizens. And the same coming back from them to the people that are out there protesting. Those are the people that they've taken the oath to serve and protect. And whether they like you or the job you're doing, tough shit that comes with the territory. You have to deal with that. You have to be above that. With great power comes great responsibility. And when you have tanks and helicopters and guns, you have a lot of power. And it needs to be used wisely. And just the tone of so many of these demonstrations that have turned violent and chaotic by the end is heartbreaking, and it's frustrating, and it makes me physically angry. And I just don't know how we fix it, but I'm hopeful that the passion is there to try to drive towards change and to do it peacefully but disruptively. I mean, that's what protests are supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm encouraged by all the younger generation really coming out in full force. And the cynical part of me in the past might have questioned that, and still does a little bit, especially when you see the thing like the girl who stopped the person from boarding up their store to take the Instagram picture. And I'm sure that there are people that are out there with their own selfish reasons in mind. But I do think that a lot of people have been moved to act and aren't going to stay silent anymore, and are going to band together to try to force the hand and really dictate some change.
And that's the silver lining that we can take away from this, is that it is getting people to, ourselves included, to take action and move on to the point where we kind of changed around our show lineup completely from what we normally do, because we typically don't talk about this type of stuff, at least at this type of length.
And this time, how can you not?
Exactly. So when we return next week, maybe a point where we can start talking about other topics. There is a lot to talk about in the world of sports, but we are not going to address that because this is a lot more important, and it's affecting us way more than whether some league is coming back or what some athletes said. And so I think that's something that we agreed upon while we were texting this week, planning the show and talking about how we wanted to approach things. And that's certainly been a growing experience, I would say.
Yeah. And if I could offer just as a closing thought, first of all, it's a sincere thank you to anyone who's made it this far in the podcast. But I thought this was too important an issue for us to not really dive into and to talk about. And honestly, this has been therapeutic for me, just to try to talk this out with you and figure out how I feel about some of this stuff. And hopefully something that I said here tonight is important to someone or helps them to know that they're not the only person that's having those types of feelings and asking those types of questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I agree. It's really one of the things that I love about doing this podcast with you is that, we get a chance to hash things out. And sometimes it's just about sports or about, how we feel about certain things in the world of sports, but it's changed this week, obviously. And it's really nice to kind of have someone to, in a rather, formal way, to discuss with. And I think that's what's happening in a lot of conversations around the world right now. People are just let's just talk. And so I think that's important. I'll close with this to kind of piggyback on what you're saying. So I work in a department where I have a manager who has about 13 people that work underneath him, and very, very good manager. I actually had a call with him today. Very nice guy. And then his manager, he's like the top of the top. He's already gotten to the very top, and he manages our department. And he's a guy that I've only talked to once, not because he's unapproachable. It's just we different schedules, and he's sort of very busy with interviews and meetings and running the department. So I met him once when I first got hired, and he was already a legend in my eyes. And then I didn't ever talk to him again, and I read his emails and stuff. And I believe it was on Tuesday or Wednesday of this week. He reached out to me on our chat application and just basically said, "Yo, dude, I feel so bad about all the violence that's going on. I wanted to see if you're okay, if we can talk." And it really meant a lot because he's a guy that I look up to a lot, but it also was really cool to see someone who's a manager of my department. I mean, he is the guy. And to see him reach out and say like, "Hey, I'm here for you if you need anything." And then we kind of had a little back and forth discussion, and it was great. And I think that's the thing that again, silver lining we can take away from this is there are people like him who probably have a very different experience from what I have, not just in racial differences, but life experience, and obviously his professional experience. I mean, the guy, seriously, he is unbelievably talented. But to hear from him in this crazy time, I was like, it just feels good. Excuse me. To hear from him in this crazy time, it just feels good to know that, I have that support. And so that's what I'm taking away from all this, is trying to be positive, being practical, but also being positive and saying, we're going to get through this. And on the other side of it, COVID and the racial issues that we're having and police brutality, we're going to come out of this on the other end, and it's going to be a better world because we made it that way and because people decided to make a change. So with that being said, I do want to thank anybody who's still listening in at this point in the podcast. Obviously, we're available on all your podcatcher applications. We're available on Twitter at The Word Podcast. Feel free to drop us a note there, what you feel about what's going on in the world. We'll be back next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Now, normally we end the show and we do nicknames. I'm not doing nicknames this week. Doesn't feel right, does it?
It doesn't. And I had that thought. I meant to talk to you about it in the green room. And this just shows how in sync we are after all these years.
Mind meld, yes.
Yeah.
But we do want to thank you all for listening. For my esteemed co-host, Richard Bruce Abernathy, I am James Israel Mundia. Thank you for listening to The Word, and we will see you all soon.